Hi, I'm Anna. Thank you for joining or welcome back. Today I want to talk about the importance of retention of information. As presenters and facilitators, we work really hard to make sure that the content that we're providing is relevant, that it's important. And did you know that about 90% of what you prepare actually never gets thought about again? Well, not never. It never gets thought about after about 2 weeks. So there's lots of studies done on this. The learning pyramid is a really good example of the distinctions of what is learned at what point. So if somebody simply hears something during a lecture, so you go, you sit on something and you hear it, you're retaining about 5% of a lecture, and this is after 2 weeks. Or if you've read it, you've retained about 10% of what you've read. Think, right? So audio visual, if you watch a video, if it's a little bit more involved, typically 2 weeks after, it's about 20% that you'll be able to recall, and that's where the visual part of what you do is so important. 30%. 2 weeks later is retained after there's been a live demonstration. So think about when you have ever attended anything, when it's actually demonstrated. For those visual learners, which most of us are, demonstrations are super important. So about 30% of the retention is when we've actually seen something demonstrated. Where it starts to get interesting is when we start getting into group discussion. So 50% of information is retained when we've actually had a group discussion around it. So for those of us that are conducting seminars, for those of us that are facilitating classes, how important is that number in actually making sure that we have some sort of a group discussion or a pair share after we've presented a topic or after we've presented an idea? Now, where it starts to get really interesting is that 75% of new information that is learned is retained after 2 weeks if they have a chance to practice it. So we don't always have an opportunity to do a huge hands-on workshop, but regardless of the kind of training that you're doing, think about how do I actually make this tangible and how do I give my attendees an opportunity to practice this hands-on, even if it's 10 people per an item, or even if it's in a group setting, them actually practicing it will retain their information 75% in 2 weeks, which is pretty remarkable. Now, where the magic really hits the road, you guys, is when we have somebody teach what they just learned. So when you teach someone that's something that you just learned, you actually retain 90% of that information in 2 weeks. Let's talk about why that's so important. What happens to your brain when you are asked to recall the information, not only recall it and remember it, but to actually transfer that knowledge to somebody else? So when you ask somebody to teach something that they just learned, what happens to their brain? It goes into concentration mode. It goes into working out and figuring out the mistakes and the obstacles of not remembering all of the information. So it goes into a problem solution format, which is really, really beneficial for us. So there's something called Teach for Transfer. And what Teach for Transfer is actually just that. You teach somebody a concept, you teach them an idea, you teach them a skill, and you're asking them to instantly transfer that information to somebody next to them. There is, depending on the workshop or the type of facilitation that you're doing, it's often called, it can be done through group workshops, it can be done through a pair share, it can be in a debrief, it can be done a lot of different ways. The importance is, if you really want somebody to remember something, make sure that they're explaining that information to somebody else. Because again, what you have to say is too important for 90% of it to be forgotten. So remember, the next time that you're preparing a class or a lecture, after 2 weeks, your attendees are only going to remember about 5% of what you've told them. Or they can remember 90% of what you've shared if you teach them how to share that information and teach it to other people. So remember that when you're putting together your activities, remember that when you're asking them to participate, and remember that when you're closing the day and what the call to action is for what they do when they leave your class. Thanks for watching. I hope this was helpful. If it was, please give it a thumbs up, and I'll see you next time. And remember, tell somebody about what you learned today. 90% is a big deal. See you next time.